Okay, so Parshas VeEra we're now in the second portion of the book of Exodus, Parshas VeEra, and that really goes together with Parshas Bo. VeEra and Bo go together because the 10 plagues are tracked in these two portions, the 10 plagues. So what I want to do, I spent some time a few years ago, a number of years ago, I remember seeing a commentary, a very insightful commentary by Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch about the 10 plagues in general. I know for myself that whenever I learn about the 10 plagues, I feel that sometimes they are disparate plagues, and I've never really appreciated the connection and the symmetry and the big picture plan of the 10 plagues. So I decided to make a chart, a table out of it. So I'm going to share the screen, and we're going to go through the 10 plagues, but not from the perspective of the details of them necessarily, but in the grand picture, in the grand scheme of what the 10 plagues were trying to achieve. The overarching methodology and strategy of the Egyptians against the Jewish people was to carry them through three phases of exile, starting with marginalization and gerus, as it's called. Gerus is estrangement of whoever the people are who was in your country. So, as we've seen historically during the Holocaust, Spanish Inquisition, persecution never begins dramatically and emphatically to start persecuting whoever the people are they are expressing their anti-Semitism towards. It always starts off with a level of estrangement and marginalization of that group of people, that community. So the same thing with the Egyptians as well. This took over a period of 210 years altogether. But it started off with, general estrangement, gerus. Then it went into actual slavery, putting the Jews under slavery, avdus, and then the final phase of the persecution was actual affliction, inui, affliction and harsh, terrible, painful affliction that they imposed upon the Jewish people. So those are the three phases, and the 10 plagues, Rav Hirsch explains, corresponds to those three phases. And the 10 plagues were a systematic operation to overturn the entire infrastructure and power of Egyptian civilization in a manner that perfectly mirrored the Egyptian mistreatment of the Jewish people. In the same way that the Egyptians gradually intensified their imposition upon the Jewish people from estrangement to abject affliction, so too the plagues followed the same pattern. Moreover, the plagues targeted and this is a very important aspect of it, they targeted every stratum of Egyptian existence, from the ground below to the atmosphere above, thereby totally eradicating every trace of power and prestige they once enjoyed. So, I said before that there are 3 levels, 1, 2, and 3, estrangement, slavery, and affliction. In the estrangement stage of it, the Egyptians made the Jews feel estranged. The goal of the plagues was to now reciprocally, mida keneged mida, Hashem to make the Egyptians feel themselves estranged and unsettled even in their own land. This is the measure for measure punishment. For the fact that they engaged in humiliation and enslavement of the Jewish people, that's the second phase, Hashem humiliated them and destroyed their sources of pride and power. And in response to the affliction that they imposed upon the Jewish people, so then Hashem's going to afflict them through abject pain and suffering. That's the structure of the 10 plagues. Now, we know in the Haggadah, one of the famous parts of the Haggadah is at the end of, before we wash for bread, at the end of the Haggadah, when we talk about the 10 plagues, after the recitation of the 10 plagues, the Haggadah says that the 10 plagues can be organized in three phrases, Datzach, Adash, Ba'achav. Datzach is for blood, frogs, and lice. Adash is for wild animals, pestilence, and boils. And Ba'achav is hail, locust, darkness, and the death of the firstborn. And the question is, why do we need to organize the plagues in these 3 series? So Rav Hirsch explains that because the goal of the plagues is to destroy Egypt from top to bottom, so each of these 3 series corresponds to the land, that's series number 1, the inhabitants upon the land, 2, and the third series is the sky. So that the plagues are going out to set a goal of destroying Egypt on all 3 stratums through the phases of estrangement, slavery, and affliction. They're targeting all of those 3 different categories. So let's go through them. Let's look, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at the first plague and the second plague and the third plague in each group. So the first phase of persecution was estrangement. They estranged the Jewish people, so Hashem now estranges and makes them unsettled in their own land. How does he do that? The very first plague is blood. Blood is the first, and that's that targets or either targets or emanates from the land. Obviously the land, the rivers. Because why is that the first plague? Because that's the source of their security. The Nile, they don't have regular rainfall in Egypt, and their whole source of agriculture and sustenance in Egypt was the Nile River. When that turns to blood, their entire source of security fails them. And there's no greater unsettling feeling than that. And now we no longer have our source of sustenance. So that's the first. So that's the estrangement, reciprocal, mida connected mida, measure for measure response that Hashem does to the Egyptians on the land level. In the second series of plagues, in the Adash series, the first one is also the same goal, but except on the inhabitants of the land. What are the inhabitants of the land? The wild animals. What's the significance of that? Because the fact that wild animals can now barge in to villages and residential areas and cities of Egypt, not staying within the boundaries of the wild outside of Egypt, outside of the cities of Egypt, the borders are broken. And there's nothing more unsettling than that, than the borders that provide safety are broken down. It's also targeting and creating this sense of estrangement and unsettlement in the minds of the experience of the Egyptians within their own land itself. And then the third series of plagues, the third series is the Be'achav. Same thing again, but in the sky. So what happens in the sky? The hail. What's the significance of the hail? The climate radically changes, making them feel like they're living in a different country altogether. So the target of the first plague of each of the three series is to create an estrangement for the Jewish people, for the Egyptians, an unsettled feeling in their own land. The second phase, the second plague of each series is now targeting the slavery that they impose upon the Jewish people. Now slavery comes about because they lord themselves over the Jewish people. That's what slavery is about, lording yourself over another person, humiliating that person, and enslaving the person. So Hashem does exactly the same thing. He humiliates and enslaves, humiliates and destroys the pride of the Egyptians. He humiliates the Egyptians by bringing frogs. Why frogs? Because there's nothing more of a timid and small, timid animal than a frog. The frog is afraid. You go up to a frog will jump away and hide away. But the frogs have no shame whatsoever. They come right out and they land on people's heads, and they are sitting on the heads of Paro, on the head of Paro. Total humiliation, being menaced by small and timid creatures. This is all with the goal of humiliating and breaking down the pride of the Egyptians. In the second phase, where it's targeting the inhabitants of the land, second stratum, is the pestilence, because pestilence attacks the cattle and the horses. Their source of power and pride, they're all killed. That's also that their whole pride is being broken down. And the third series is against the sky, or coming from the sky, is the locusts, which cause destruction to the crops, which is the source of their riches. So everything in the second group are all targeting to the destruction of their pride and power and humiliating them. And the third series of plagues, the third plague in each group, is targeting the affliction that they afflicted the Jewish people with. So Hashem afflicts them, and it's very simple to see. The affliction on the land is the lice. I mean, the lice having lice all over you, which is a horrible, terrible discomfort, terrible affliction on the inhabitants of the land, i.e. the people themselves. Boils, terrible pain. And the third is in the sky, is terrible anguish of the darkness, which lasted for 3 days. The emotional and psychological anguish that they were put through that darkness for 3 days was an example of affliction emanating from the sky and targeting that mida connected measure for measure for what the Egyptians did to the Jewish people. And that's the whole sequence of the plagues. And I thought that was really, to me at least, was very insightful. The last plague, of course, is the final all-encompassing blow of the death of the firstborn. Because the commentaries say that really the death of the firstborn really contained everything all in one. But so that's the final Makkah B'Patish, the final hammer blow, which brings about the Exodus. But this is how Rav Hirsch explains the sequence of the plagues and how they all fit into a bigger picture plan. And to me, this is other commentaries do the same thing, but this happened to really, I found a lot of insight into this. So this is number one. So that's the plagues. That's one thing. Now, while the plagues are also targeting. They're targeting the Egyptians specifically in this measure for measure punishment. We have to realize also another extremely important principle, and what I'm going to say now I've said before. It's probably the most famous commentary of Nachmanides in the entire Torah, and that is the fact that the entire story of the plagues, the Exodus, the splitting of the Red Sea, the entire story, the entire episode is a profound and tremendous lesson for us to realize that Hashem is involved in the affairs of mankind. That's what the Ramban says is one of the purposes of this entire story. And the Ramban says over here, he says, while the 10 plagues were intended as a measure for measure response for the Egyptian treatment of the Jewish people, the message for the Jewish people themselves was to also instill in our minds and hearts the fundamental truths of how Hashem's providence works. He says at the end of Parshas Bo, there are various false theological beliefs that people have had throughout history. And the purpose of the 10 plagues, the Exodus, the revelation at Sinai, are all being orchestrated to negate those false beliefs. And what are the 3 primary false beliefs that people have had and do have today? There's atheism, which is no God whatsoever. There's the clockwork universe theory. What's the clockwork universe? The God created the universe, wound it up, and left. A creator who left, no longer having any awareness of it. Many people believe that. At least they make themselves believe that. When you start thinking about it, it doesn't make any sense. Why would God create this universe and leave it? I mean, it doesn't make any sense, but people make themselves to believe this in order to justify their free behavior to do what they want, how they want, whenever they want. But that's the psychology behind it. But then there are people actually who do ascribe to the belief of what's called deism, which is belief in a creator who's aware but does not intervene with the universe, let alone man. So he's aware. He's aware of what's going on, but doesn't intervene. There are others who believe also deism perhaps can be broken into 2 categories, or there's another name for it, I don't know. But there's another belief that is that God is aware of the big picture functioning of the universe, but doesn't get involved with the details of human beings. But these beliefs are all the false theological beliefs about God, which obviously is antithetical to Judaism. And the Ramban says that the timed and targeted miracles of the Exodus from Egypt came to negate all these beliefs, showing that Hashem is aware of his world and does intervene with the affairs of man when he so pleases. Moreover, because these miracles were announced beforehand through the mouth of the prophet Moshe, the axiom that Hashem speaks to man and reveals his will is also demonstrated. This point in turn supports their belief in the revelation of Mount Sinai. So this is the importance of this whole story. This is so important, this is so axiomatic, this is so fundamental. Everything rests upon the plagues, everything rests upon the Exodus from Egypt, everything rests upon this story. This is why we emphasize it so much. The Ramban goes on to say this, the reason why we emphasize the story of the Exodus, and it repeats itself so many times in the liturgy. Everything is a remembrance for the Exodus of Egypt. You know, we make Kiddush on Friday night to remember the Exodus. We put on tefillin to remember the Exodus. We sit in the sukkahs to remember the Exodus. Why is such a big fanfare made about the Exodus? Because the Exodus represents and inculcates into our conscience all of these fundamentals of belief, that God punishes those who commit atrocities and crimes against humanity, even if it takes a long, we don't know exactly when judgment comes down. It's not our business to say when God should exact judgment and when he shouldn't exact judgment, but it happens. But the other principles also that God sees what's going on. He's aware. This is not a clockwork universe. He's involved in our lives. He's involved in our lives, and everything which is happening is completely under his watchful eye, and there's not a single thing which is not interceded and aware of by God. Again, we don't understand the workings of God. It has nothing to do with that. We don't understand his ways, but that he knows is clearly demonstrated in the Exodus. So that's a very important introduction, which probably should always be emphasized at different junctures, because it's part of what we, there's actually a book I have over here. I was reading a chapter of this book. It's called The Encyclopedia of Moral and Ethical Values. I was reading it together with some people this week. There's a chapter over here, And it happened to be this week. I was reading. It's called "God, Is He Really Watching Us?" He talks about over here this same idea. Is He really watching us? Well, of course He's really watching us. This is part of what we believe. This is the axioms of Judaism, as we just saw. But the question is why do we not believe it, or why do we not? How come we don't live with it? I mean, if God's really watching us, it would be like a child who has a parent or a kid in his classroom where the teacher is the kid knows the teacher is there all the time. He's going to behave differently because he knows the teacher or the parent is watching over him. So people do deny this idea. They deny it. They go into this cognitive dissonance type of mode of denying these truths in order to justify their behavior. And that's what, whether it be deism or clockwork universe, those different things which the Ramban speaks about. Or also because the real reason is because Hashem gave us free will and a Yetzer Hara for the purpose of being able to overcome the darkness to see the light. That's the real reason why we don't always see it, because it's part of the challenge of life. We have to find God. We have to look for Him. He didn't just make it easy for us to see. We have to be able to think and look and see and recognize that God is really behind everything which goes on. And those who know me from private sessions, I frequently talk about what's going on in the world at large. In case anyone didn't realize, there's been a pandemic for the past 2 years, right? But that alone is also an incredible forum for being able to teach us: is God really watching us? Is He seeing us? And how do we connect to God? And what is really going on behind the scenes? That's also very much when we believe that this is an independent power with an independent solution, separate from God. That's antithetical to our philosophy, right? There's no independent power of the virus. There's no independent power of the vaccine, right? They're not independent. It's God controlling everything, but giving us different vehicles and sending us different messages through these different channels, but it's all ultimately Hashem. But I don't want to get into that larger different discussion. I just want to stay focused more on this message over here about the plagues, about the Exodus, all to teach us the axioms of Judaism. That's my little introduction to these two portions. This is applicable to both of these two portions. Very, very important.